So this morning we are continuing our series of discovering the Christ you always thought existed, hoped existed, wanted to exist. But today we're doing a story about Jesus, and it comes from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, I always hoped and wanted there to be a Jesus that didn't just care about the people that I grew up with, right? Because I grew up in conservative Christian America, and Jesus only cared about us, right? Because we said the right words, we said the right prayers, so that's why Jesus cared about us. Everybody else, Jesus liked them, but they were on the outside. But then, so I moved away from that, and I was like, Jesus, he cares about the poor. Always cares about the poor. I read this guy, Gustavo Gutierrez's work, and he was like, Jesus is always on the side of the poor, and I was like, man, that's great. That's it. God, loves poor people and doesn't love those other people. Right? But today we have a story where Jesus loves both. And I think that's what, in this time, a lot of us are hoping for. Is a Jesus that loves the Trump campaign as much as the Sanders campaign and everything in between. A Jesus that loves black and white, cop and criminal. So let's get into this story, right? Jesus and his disciples had just taken a journey on a boat over water. There's a lot of speculation of where they went to, how far it was, what kind of journey it was. Who knows, right? It just says they went across the water. Jesus meets this guy. He's chained up in a cemetery. He's got all these demons in him, and Jesus is like, get out of that guy. All these pigs die. All the people there, they're like, Jesus, thanks for helping that guy we chained in the cemetery, but we really need you to leave. And so they get back on the boat and they come back. So the disciples are kind of sitting there like, oh man, this was really weird. We don't like pork, we're Jewish, no bacon for us, please. But geez, Jesus, you have to kill all the pigs? I'm sure one of them was like, but that one was a teacup pig. Or come on, man. But so they're in the boat, they're getting out, and all these people have heard about Jesus' miracles and stuff, and he'd just gone away and he's coming back. And so a crowd gathers. People are getting out their cell phones. They want selfies. They're posting hashtag Jesus, hashtag Judean Lives Matter, whatever's going on, right? So Jesus is stepping off the boat, and there's this large crowd. So if we'll put the scripture up there, you got it? Awesome. After Jesus crossed over by boat, a large crowd met him at the seaside. One of the meeting place leaders named Jairus came. When he saw Jesus, he fell to his knees beside himself as he begged, "My dear daughter is at death's door. Come lay hands on her so she will get well and live." Jesus went with him, and the whole crowd tagging along, pushing and jostling him. So Jesus is already tired, right? He's just gotten done from a trip. Some of you have traveled. As soon as you get home, what's the first thing you want to do, right? Is get into a big crowd of people and go walking to someone's house you've never been to before? Probably not. So you got a tired Jesus who sees this man, falls down before him. I mean, we don't know if Jesus ever met Jairus before, even knows who he is, but all of a sudden this well-dressed guy just runs through the crowd, pushing through this crowd, and falls at Jesus' feet. Now it's interesting that Jairus would do this, because Jairus is the leader of the synagogue, which is kind of like being a pastor, but it's also kind of like being the mayor. You're both, because the synagogue is the place where you decide legal disputes. It's the place where everyone goes and talks about God and what the scriptures mean. So this is an elite man. This is upper class. He's nobility. He's well-dressed. He's well-groomed. He probably smells like frankincense, which if you don't know what that smells like, it's kind of really cool smelling pine trees. But he smells like frankincense, and he's so well groomed, and he falls in front of this wild-haired, moth-eaten tunic guy that just got off a boat and probably smells like fish, named Jesus, who is the enemy of the elitists in this time. Jesus doesn't want to be their enemy. They feel like Jesus is their enemy. He's just trying to be like, hey, I'm doing my Jesus thing. Y'all come on board, right? But so they get off the boat, and Jairus falls down in front of him. And Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. And some more about Jairus is like this 12-year-old daughter, she's, in the Jewish eyes of things, she's 1 year away from becoming an adult, right? He'd watched her grow for 12 years. He cared about her for 12 years. And they don't mention any other children, and a lot of scholars and tradition over the years have said that this is his only child, right? He's only had a daughter, and then this is a time when daughters aren't very valued. Like, daughters were valued by like how many goats you could get from that daughter when you like sold her off to somebody else. And so here's a man that, number one, loves his daughter. He's watched her grow. How many people in here have daughters, right? They can be a joy, right? I'm sure they can be a pain as well. I don't have any kids, so, but they can be a joy, and you watch them, and you watch them grow and become these people over time. And here's his little girl, and she's dying. And he's risking everything so that Jesus can come and save her. When he falls at Jesus' feet, he's not just begging Jesus and people will be like, oh, that's cool, you got Jesus to heal your daughter. No, he's like standing up against the people who are his bosses. He's standing up against his government and his religious order to fall at the feet of this man, to fall at the feet of Jesus and just ask for his daughter to be healed. So Jairus is risking his position. He's risking his daughter's life. And he's risking his reputation within his faith community. But within that crowd, there was another woman, and she had spent her whole adult life on the outskirts of town. Because for 12 years, she suffered from a bleeding from her uterus. And so for 12 years, she was viewed as unclean, untouchable. Her husband divorced her. The doctors took all of her money. And she just had lived one of the worst, most awful lives you could have lived. Like a lot of people live in our society, right? People that you just don't notice anymore because you've thrown them away. So for 12 years, this woman had to live seeing everyone she loved and cared about, but not being able to touch any of them. Can you imagine that? 12 years without anyone touching you, bumping into you, coming near you for fear that you would make them unclean. Just let that sink in, 12 years of that, right? I think about like some of the worst times in my life and how ostracized and outsider I felt in my life, but for 12 years to not even be able to know the touch of another person. No handshakes, no pat on the shoulder, not even be able to share food or water with anyone you came across. So she's in this crowd, and she'd heard about Jesus because even though she's on the outskirts, she's still around everybody. She's one of those invisible people that people just talk like they're not even there. And she'd heard about him, and she wondered if this Jesus could heal her. She wondered if she got healed, would her husband come back? Would Jesus make it to where she could at least earn money again and didn't have to live off the scraps that people threw away? She wondered if he could make her clean. She wondered if he could fix this thing that everyone had told her was her fault. And that was her shame. And so she comes up behind Jesus, creeping up within the crowd, people parting away from her because they don't want to touch her. And the woman, in verse 25 through 29, a woman who had suffered a condition of hemorrhaging for 12 years, a long succession of physicians had treated her and treated her badly, taking all her money and leaving her worse off than before. Had heard about Jesus, she slipped in from behind and touched his robes. She was thinking to herself, if I can put a finger on his robe, I can get well. The moment she did, the flow of blood dried up. She could feel the change and knew her plague was over and done with. How many of us in this room have had people that said they could heal us? Have had people that said they could fix what was wrong in our lives, only to be left off worse, to be left without money, to be left without friends and family, How many of us have suffered thinking that we're wrong and something in us is wrong and that it needed to be fixed, and all that people could do was make it worse and worse? But this woman who had struggled and been plagued by this in one moment touches Jesus, and not even Jesus, but his clothes. And not even his, like, it's not like she's like running up and touching his inside clothes. This is the little cape thing flowing off the back of Jesus, right? Like, Jesus was fancy, y'all. But he probably shopped at House of Lamond. But so she touches Jesus' cloak. And she's so guilty. She feels so guilty and bad about herself. She doesn't identify herself to Jesus. She doesn't ask Jesus to heal her. She just comes up and touches him, his cloak, because if she was to touch him physically, she felt like she would make him unclean because of the purity laws that happened back then, right? So she doesn't want to make Jesus unclean. She just wants to get healed. And all of a sudden she's healed. Like this problem that has been inside of her, this physical ailment, is healed, but she's not completely healed yet, right? Because she's so ashamed that she just touches him and then she just kind of backs off, right? She still hasn't been healed in her soul. That damage, that otherness that she's been for so long still hasn't been healed. So Jesus, let's jump to verse 30. Jesus, at that same moment, Jesus felt the energy discharging from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" Now, our favorite people, the disciples, who Rich likes to call knuckleheads. Sometimes I just feel like, they're doing the best they can with what they got, guys. But his disciples look around at him and say, "What are you talking about? With this crowd pushing and jostling you, you're asking, 'Who touched me?' Dozens have touched you." So they're still cranky from the boat ride, right? And they're like, "Oh my goodness, Jesus, why? Why do you need to know who touched you?" But Jesus isn't just wanting to be like, "Who took my power," right? This isn't like a comic book. This isn't like Green Lantern or Avengers or whatever. Like, Jesus didn't just lose his superpowers, but he wants to know who touched him because he wants to finish healing her. Because we can fix these things that are on the outside. We can fix these things that everyone can see. We have doctors and hospitals that can cure all of these things, but there's still something inside of us that's broken sometimes because of how the world has treated us and because of how we have treated ourselves. So Jesus looks at her and she comes forward. She steps forward. Verse 32 through 33. But he went on asking, looking around to see who had done it. The woman, knowing what had happened, knowing she was the one, stepped up in fear and trembling and knelt before him and gave him the whole story. She is afraid because she is afraid that this rabbi, this teacher, this healer, the Son of God is about to scold her for making him unclean. Her whole life has been being mistreated. But now she looks into these eyes, these dangerous eyes of this wild-haired rabbi from the outskirts of the whole province. And Jesus looks at her with compassion. In verse 34, Jesus said to her, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed, be healed of your plague." She's already been healed of her physical plague. So what's Jesus healing? He's healing that plague in her heart. He's healing that plague that's inside of her, that she's been ignored, she's been mistreated. She's now made whole through Jesus. And this is the only time that we have recorded that Jesus called anyone daughter. That's a big statement. He makes her family. She had no family. She had been rejected and thrown away, and he makes her family. How many of you need Jesus to make you family? How many of you are looking for that? I know I was. I know that's why through all of the years, Jesus and I never parted. I might have been in different places with Jesus, but we were always still family. Because there is that second healing that happens. And while all of this is happening, who knows how long this took? 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes? Don't forget about Jairus, right? Jairus is like, I humbled myself. I risked everything, Jesus, and you're wasting your time on this woman. My daughter's dying, my little girl. How many times in our lives do we look at that person on the street, right? And we look at her and we're like, well, she kind of deserves to be there. But we look at the little child that's suffering, and it's easy to see why we need to help that. And it's good to help a child that's suffering. Please do not walk away from here thinking I'm saying do not help the little children. But Jesus takes the time even for the person that we don't care about. Jesus takes the time to look at that woman and say, I love you, daughter, even while we're freaking out about the other things we think need to be done first. So Jairus, in verse 35, Jairus, while he was still talking, some people came up from the leader's house and told him, your daughter is dead, why bother the teacher anymore? Now, some of you know that I worked as a chaplain for a long time. Not a long time, but for about a year. I was a chaplain at Gaston Memorial. And I don't know if you've ever had to tell a parent that their child is dead, but there's something very, very awful that happens in that moment. It's almost like a light in their eye goes out forever. And that's not to say there's no hope or anything like that, but if you've never been with someone when their child has died, it is probably one of the most gut-wrenching emotional things I've ever had to witness. And it's rough. And Jairus, his friends come from his house to tell him his daughter's dead. What had to have been going through his mind, right? Here's Jesus wasting his time healing this lady. He could have healed her later. She's waited 12 years, right? But his daughter, she's dead now. What's Jesus going to be able to do now? He wanted Jesus to heal his daughter, to lay some hands on, to heal her so she'd be well. But raising people from the dead, that just doesn't happen. And so Jairus is heartbroken. 12 years of hope. All the plans that he had for his daughter, all the ideas of the grandchildren that would come, and everything that would be brought through this little girl had just died. But Jesus, going back to what I said at the beginning, Jesus, this Messiah, this healer, this God for everyone, hears what these people are saying. And in verse 36, Jesus overheard what they are talking about and said to the leaders, don't listen to them, just trust me. His daughter just died, right? If your child just died and Rich or I or somebody was up here and said, I get it, man, your daughter just died, but trust me, I'm going to do something, you'd probably punch me. But Jairus, there's something different in Jesus, right? Jesus, he just watched him heal this lady that they'd all seen for years. They wouldn't let her go into synagogue. They wouldn't let her eat in the town. But Jesus had just healed her. So for some reason, at this place of no hope, Jairus decides to hope in Jesus. So in 37 through 40, he permitted no one to go with him except Peter, James, and John. They entered the leader's house and pushed their way through the gossips looking for a story and the neighbors bringing in casseroles. This is the Message version. I really liked that part about casseroles. If you've grown up in any sort of evangelical background, you're probably used to casseroles randomly showing up whenever there's a tragedy. And sometimes that is the neighbors, and sometimes it's the people looking for gossip. Why all this busybody grief and gossip is what Jesus says to them. This child isn't dead, she is sleeping. Provoked to sarcasm, they told him he didn't know what he was talking about. These people don't know Jesus. They're doing the right thing. They've got the casseroles prepared. They've got the people mourning and wailing, ready to go. They're being the good neighbors, right? And here comes in this man who abruptly just says, she's not dead, she's just sleeping. These are people that know what death looks like. These are people that are like, no, she's dead. And you're being mean to the family by saying this. But Jesus, he cared so much about Jairus' daughter, and he knew what he could do for Jairus and his family, that he shows up anyway. And he kind of he just doesn't even care about the scoffers, right? He doesn't care about the haters. He doesn't care about the people that are showing up and saying, you can't do that. He's there for Jairus' wife, Jairus' daughter. And Jairus had a plan of how this healing was going to work out. He had a plan of how God was going to step in and do things. And I think from those of us in a position of privilege, a lot of times that's where we stay with God, right? We know what God's going to do for us. We know who God's going to be for us. And we sometimes even pray to God the exact things we want from God and how God should do that. I was in a prayer meeting one time and literally this girl was mapping out her entire week for God and at what points God was going to show up and what things God was going to do. And I got in trouble at the prayer meeting because I was be very careful trying to trap a deity. And she was like, what? And I was like, you can't tell God what to do. Because God likes to step in and do something a little different than what our plans were. Because Jairus just asked for a healing, but Jesus was like, I'm going to raise your daughter from the dead. As we see in verse 40 through 43. But when he had sent them all out, he took the child's father and mother along with his companions. So Jesus is there with the child's mother, the father, and his 3 disciples behind him. I think that's interesting. He wants this to be a holy moment for this family, right? He's not flashy if somebody today was going to raise the dead, they'd probably call the news. They'd probably call a blog post, Facebook. It'd be everywhere, right? But Jesus closes the door, takes in the people that he needs to be there. He clasps the little girl's hand. And in Hebrew, or in Aramaic, he says, Talitha kum, which means little girl, get up. He doesn't say magic words. He doesn't say a long prayer. Jesus is a God in the flesh, but a God in the flesh that is pretty simple about how he goes about things and just says, little girl, get up. And at that, she was walking around. This girl was 12 years of age. They, of course, were all beside themselves with joy. He gave them strict orders that no one was to know what had taken place in that room. And then he said, give her something to eat. So here we have Jesus in humbleness raising this girl from the dead. These parents that had just experienced the worst grief that anyone could go through, all of a sudden are now presented with probably one of the greatest joys any parent can go through, right? Your child has been lost and now is back. And Jesus tells them, but don't tell anybody about this joy, right? Because sometimes when we get healed or something happens with us, with God, we need to keep that to ourselves. Because sometimes those things are just between us and God. But then you have a practical Jesus that says, give her something to eat. It's not abracadabra. It's not look at how great I am. It's hey, she's probably hungry. She just came back from the dead. Get her a Krispy Kreme, right? Those are kosher. And I have to wonder if Jairus and his wife ever found that first woman who had delayed Jesus. I have to wonder if maybe they looked at those discarded people in their society as people to bring back in. Did they really change that day? Did their daughter being raised from the dead, being brought back to them, change their hearts? Did they see that this was a God that didn't just love the poor? This was a God that didn't just love the rich. This was a God that didn't just love the righteous. This is a God that doesn't just love the wicked. This is a God that loves everybody for who they are, what they are, and where they are. In church, I ask you, do we have the faith do we have faith for ourselves and for this world? Have we decided how Jesus should heal us? Have we decided how Jesus should heal the rest of the world? Have we decided that this is the way we do things and that's the only way we do things? Have we decided this is the only place where people can be? Because this is a place of unity, right? In a minute we're going to take communion as a symbol of unity. And if we are to be that example of unity in the world, we need to understand that God's love and healing and transforming power doesn't just happen here at Missiongathering. And you don't hear that a lot at churches because I really want you all to come to Missiongathering. But God's love and healing power happens in other places too. So if this is a home for you, thank you, and that's awesome, and I'm glad we can be. But there are so many places where God's working. And there are so many people that we are diametrically opposed to and feel awful about that are having rallies for HB2, that are having rallies against things that we love and people that we care about, and even some people in this room. And I have to tell you that God is present in their lives and doing some healing works within them as well. And that we have to remember that they are a part of us as much as we are a part of them. Because this Jesus that you always hoped existed, that you always hoped cared about you, has to care about them too. Or it's not a Jesus worth following. And that's a hard lesson for us to learn with us being people that are trying to follow Jesus as well and imitate him. Because it's hard to love some people. For me, it'd be easier to love the woman on the street than it would be to love Jairus. For some people, it's easier to love Jairus than it is the woman on the street. But both are integrally important to the body of Christ. And if we can't remember that, if we can't see that person in Jesus, then we're following something that's not Jesus. We're following an image that somebody put into our hearts long ago. We're following a political movement that has nothing to do with Christ. We are to be unity in this world, and we're to love both. For those of you that were here when Jonathan Martin was here, he said we have to be here for the Trump supporter when the Trump supporter comes. And that's a silly example because I think that's a silly person as far as politics go. But we have to be here when we have a person that maybe is a very big Fourth Amendment enthusiast. That's the gun one, right? Yeah. Second Amendment. See, I love politics a lot. Go America, yeah. But yeah, so Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, 25th. But we have to be here when there's people that aren't like us. And we can't just be the church that goes out and loves only the oppressed. We have to be the church that also loves the oppressor. And that is a hard task, church. Loving an oppressor, yeah, it sucks. That's a good word for it. Because everything in us wants justice, right? We want what we think justice is. But we just saw to Jesus, that's not the same thing. To Jesus, justice has been thrown aside and grace has been put in its place. And so, as we come and we take communion and we sit and we do that work with God about where are the spaces where we need to expand our love. Is it to the oppressed? Is it to the oppressor? Is it to the middle of the road person that, we just pass by? Is it someone in in our lives that we've cut off? Is it ourselves? Who do you need to start loving today? Where do you need to start healing in your own life? Because Jesus entered this town and he healed the whole community from the bottom to the top. Everyone was touched that day. So from those secret things inside of you to those more open things that everyone can see, where does the healing need to happen in your life today? Would my communion servers come forward? If this is your first time at Mission Gathering, we practice an open table. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to be confirmed. You don't have to do anything. This is a place for you to come and experience the love and the grace of God. And Jesus, when he was surrounded by some of those friends that went into a room and watched a dead girl get up and eat that Krispy Kreme donut, he went into this room with them knowing it was his last night with them, knowing that he'd taught them all he could teach and shown them all he could show. And he broke the bread and he said, "This is my body broken for you." And then a little bit later in the evening, he picked up the pitcher and held up a chalice and said, "I love you, all of you, and this is my love that I've poured out for you." So please come when you're ready. There's wine on this side and grape juice on this side. But come and do work with God. Dip the bread into the wine and take it into yourself. And say a prayer asking God, where do I need to find healing in my life? Where do I need to expand my love for others? Who am I turning a blind eye to by my own prejudice? So let's pray together, church. Father God, we ask that you bless this church, that you bring healing into their lives, that we expand who we are into the lives of those that don't act, look, or seem very close to us. That you would allow us as outsiders to bring in some insiders. And that you would take this movement to more than just where it's been before. And God, for those that we have cast aside, we ask forgiveness. And for those that you're bringing to us, we give thanks.